Alrighty, here's chapter 2. The so-called power is revealed. Give me something to read, Duncan told Andrew. Why, am I boring you? I don't mean to read to myself, said Duncan. Something I can read out loud. I already know you can read, said Andrew Tanizaki. You don't have to prove it to me. Tanizaki, just give me something, okay? Duncan said impatiently. Andrew reached into the clogged backpack he took everywhere and pulled out a creased little booklet. It was a Starpod Defender's instruction manual. Andrew had doodled cartoons all over it. Pictures of alien heads floated everywhere, all of them with long antennas coming out of their straight black hair. Now open to a random page, said Duncan. There's no such thing as random, Andrew said. My brother says. Do you want me to do this or not? Without waiting for an answer, Duncan closed his eyes and turned his head away as Andrew opened the booklet and slid it towards him. Okay, said Andrew, here. There was a silence, or at least there was silence at their end of the table. All around them, kids talked and shouted and laughed. The 7-foot-tall cafeteria giantess blew on a whistle when Duncan heard her yell, If you do not sit down, young lady, you'll have lunch with Principal Gloam. After a second, Duncan realized that the sounds of the whistle and the voices were fading. It was as if he and Tanizaki were on a train carrying them far away from Drilling Falls Middle School. Duncan felt the fingertips of his left hand grow warm, then warmer, then actually hot, as if he had one of those hand warmers in his pocket that his mother used to buy him. Now, just the way it happened in the bedroom with the dumb book about Jimmy and the gopher and the rocket ship, the fingers of his left hand became hotter and hotter. It was as though his brain was sending his fingers an urgent message. Must have heat. They grew so hot they began to hurt, and soon they pulsed as though someone had slammed a car door on them. When it seemed as though he couldn't stand the heat any longer, it leveled off, and Duncan let out his breath in relief. Are you okay? He heard Andrew Tanizaki say, and Duncan just nodded. With his eyes still shut, he ran the fingertips of his left hand across the surface of the open booklet and read aloud. Facts. Question 1. What happens if I reach a new level and get stuck inside the mind vault? Answer. If you reach one of the master levels, you should feel proud, but for those who are really impatient, cheats for reaching the next level can be found inside the Cone Star satellite. Duncan paused. And I also want to add, Andrew, he said, that you drew some doodles. They're pretty good, too. They're these little cartoons of aliens trapped in what I think is supposed to be the mind vault. Am I right? There was no reply. Duncan stopped talking and opened his eyes. The world seemed as bright as Thrifty Mike's, and the sounds of the cafeteria rolled back towards him. He turned to face Andrew, who was just staring at him, and who then muttered in a shocked voice, Yeah, you're right. What the heck is this, Dorfman? Duncan Dorfman hadn't let his power out in order to impress Andrew Tanizaki. Impressing him wouldn't improve Duncan's loneliness or nothingness at school. He had done it because he knew that if something unusual happened at their cafeteria table, the kids at the next table would know about it too. So after Duncan Dorfman read the instruction manual from Starpod Defenders aloud without looking at the words, he wasn't surprised to see a boy across the way glance over. Carl Slater was a smirking kid with a rust-colored buzz cut that always looked freshly mowed. He sat in the cafeteria at the next table every day with a bunch of other kids playing Scrabble. They were all members of the Drilling Falls Middle School Scrabble Club, though anyone who saw the way they behaved might have thought that they were looking for trouble rather than a friendly game. The year before, Carl Slater had gotten into trouble so many times at school that he'd talked back to his English teacher he'd accepted a dare to steal the notebook of a girl named Ariel Burke. He'd stood behind the cafeteria giantess and walked with his arms stretched out like Frankenstein's monster that the principal, Mr. Gloam, had insisted that he join a club and devote himself to it. Do something useful with yourself, Mr. Slater. You'll be suspended, said Mr. Gloam. Simple as that. The principal said it couldn't be a sport. He wanted Carl to focus on using only his brain for a change. The Scrabble Club at that point was very small, basically 2 kids in a room with an old board. It was Carl's mother's idea that he join the Scrabble Club. She thought it would help him get into college someday. On the first day, Carl had to be dragged in, but soon he found that he was surprisingly good at Scrabble, and then he convinced his friends to join too. Because they always did what Carl Slater said, the Scrabble Club was quickly filled with loudmouth kids, slightly wild kids, kids like Carl Slater, and they all got pretty good at the game and began to compete in local tournaments against other schools' Scrabble clubs. The year before, Drilling Falls Middle School had sent Carl Slater and Brian Kolb off to the YST, the Youth Scrabble Tournament, which was held down in Yakima, Florida every December. They'd had a good time and placed 40th out of 100 teams. Carl and Brian had returned home with a small trophy showing what appeared to be a gold-plated pizza delivery man holding up a pizza box, but it was really a person holding up a giant Scrabble tile. The first place winners of the tournament had taken home $10,000. Duncan had heard someone at school say, if Duncan had $10,000, or half of it anyways, kids' tournament Scrabble was usually played in teams of 2, he would give it to his mother and maybe they could rent their own place. Carl Slater liked to tell people that the letters in his last name could be moved around to spell 10 different words, both ones that were ordinary and ones that weren't. These included alerts, alters, artles, estral, laster, rattles, salter, staller, stellar, and tallers, all of which Carl explained to anyone who would listen. They were words you could play in the game of Scrabble. Carl was both popular and mean and smart in a way that an animal in an Aesop's fable is smart. He was a good athlete too, but lately he'd become much more obsessed with Scrabble than sports. If Duncan hadn't shown Andrew Tanizaki his power, then Carl Slater would have never seen it. But Carl, of course, saw everything. When he noticed something peculiar going on at the lunch table across from the one where he usually sat, he needed to find out more. Now he squinted at Duncan in the cafeteria, finished his lunch, and then stood up and walked over, sitting on the bench beside Tanizaki and directly across from Duncan. Carl's friend Mitchell Farley called, "Yo, Carl, what are you doing?" "Busy," Carl said, waving him off. "Busy is an anagram of Yubbs," said Mitchell. He was always looking for a way to improve his Scrabble skills. Carl just looked at him and said, "Yubbs isn't a word, Farley face," he said coldly, "but Buys is. Buys is an anagram of busy." "Oh, right," said Mitchell. Carl Slater turned to Duncan and said, "Hey, lunch meat, what were you and the Chinaman just doing?" "Nothing," said Duncan. "Some kind of sad magic trick that you found inside of a cereal box?" asked Carl. "No," said Duncan, "it wasn't a trick." "Seriously, dwarf man," said Carl, "I saw what you were doing. You looked like you memorized the Chinaman's video game booklet." "I didn't memorize it. Tell him, Tanizaki." Duncan," piped up Andrew in a nervous voice, and he stood up. "I just remembered I have to go see the nurse about that nosebleed I had last week." "Why are you standing up?" cried the cafeteria giantess, casting her long shadow across the table. "Sit down or you'll be eating with Principal Glomb," she said, and Tanizaki shrank back down. Her shadow lurched elsewhere. "I read the words with my fingers, not my eyes," Duncan said. "It's this thing I can do." "So, like you're telling me you can feel the words underneath your fingers?" said Carl Slater, not taking his eyes off Duncan. Duncan nodded, trying to appear calm. "Yeah, but only the left hand. The right hand doesn't work." Then he added, "And I can feel pictures too." From across the table, Andrew Tanizaki watched with quivering hamsterish excitement. By now, everyone else who'd been sitting at the Scrabble table had come over, and a few people from the other tables came over to see what was going on too. Someone took out a blindfold and wrapped it around Duncan Dorfman's head, tying it up with a sharp jerk. It was really a pair of gym shorts. Duncan could smell the big stinking gym beneath the slippery fabric. He smelled 1,000 long-ago dodgeball games, and he imagined himself getting smacked in the head and the stomach with ball after ball. Someone else put a magazine under his hand and said in a nasty voice, "Read, lunch meat." The table became quiet. If Duncan was ever going to have a chance to rise up from his loneliness and his loserdom, and the fact that he was just lunch meat, a boy who was forced to sit in with the Chinaman, a boy who was stuck here in Drilling Falls in a peculiar-smelling little house with his mother and his great-aunt, then this was the moment. This was it. Though his mother desperately didn't want him to stand out, he knew what he had to do. No one in this school imagined that Duncan Dorfman had anything special to offer, but maybe they were wrong, Duncan thought, and he felt his fingertips crackle once again with heat. He made his voice get loud as he said, "Road Rage Magazine, inside, Hot Wheels and Hot Babes, we've got 'em." The kids around the table started to laugh. Someone clapped. It wasn't just Duncan's fingers that burned, his face did too. He couldn't help but show off a little as he sat in the good kind of spotlight for the first time in his life. And so he added, "Then there's a picture of a young guy driving a sports car and a woman in a bikini's laying on the hood drinking a glass of lemonade, I think. Well, at least there's a slice of lemon on the side of the glass." "He's seen it before," someone insisted. Someone else said, "He's memorized it. He's got like one of those photogenic memories." A third person yelled, "What a big dumb fake, fakey McFakester." A book was angrily shoved at Duncan, so he began to read it aloud. Despite having gym shorts on his head, he read, "Was Christopher Columbus really the hero that people say he was?" The kids around the table howled. It was like lunchtime at a school for wolves. Duncan Dorfman was handed math books, diagrams of spores, sheet music from the school's a cappella group, the Drill Tones, and he quickly went from being unknown to being surrounded. I have plans for you, Dorfman, whispered Carl Slater. You ever heard of the YST, the Youth Scrabble Tournament? Yeah, said Duncan. Well, it's coming up on December 12th. I don't really play Scrabble. With your skill, you could be in it this year. You get what I'm saying? No, said Duncan. Think about it, Dorfman. You could pick letters from the bag like they were cherries from a tree, said Carl. The tiles used in tournaments are called pro tiles, and they aren't engraved with letters, they're just stamped in ink. There's no way to tell what the letters are when they're in the bag. There's no way for normal people to tell, But you could do it. You're not normal. You're a freak, Dorfman, but in a good way, he added quickly. Is it legal? Duncan asked doubtfully. No, Dorfman, you'll probably be arrested. The cops will put you in handcuffs and you'll be sent to death row. Carl paused, sighing. Is it legal? Of course it's legal. Geez, the rules of Scrabble don't say anything about some freaky fingertip power. Think of the glory, Dorfman. Think of the cash. He paused. I hear that you and your mom have no money, am I right? Duncan didn't say anything. I hear that your dad died of some disease, said Carl. Panosis, said Duncan. Whatever, and that you and your mom live in some cousin's house for free because she feels sorry for you? Great aunt. Fine, great aunt. And that your mom works at Thrifty Mike's and that your life is a little grim. Duncan felt his shoulders tense up and he opened his mouth, but Carl said, Relax, Dorfman. I'm not mocking you. I'm just saying this doesn't have to be the case anymore. We'll talk later at your locker, okay? Okay, said Duncan, but he felt deeply uncomfortable and almost about to throw up or faint and fall down on the floor. Carl Slater left the table just as Duncan was carried off into the sea of kids. Somewhere in that sea, Andrew Tanazaki's head bobbed up, then went under. It would be a long time before the two of them would sit at the same lunch table again.